The Basis of Realism by Bertrand Russell. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Landon D.C. Elkind at the University of Iowa in Iowa City, Iowa. The Basis of Realism. Quote, "The program and first platform of 6 realists," end of quote, which appeared in this journal last July, footnote 1, volume 7, number 15, pages 393 to 401, end of footnote 1, gives expression to a growing movement in philosophy in a way which deserves the gratitude of all who are in sympathy with that movement. As I find myself in almost complete agreement with the "6 realists," end of quote, I have thought it might be desirable to attempt on my own account a somewhat similar statement of my philosophical opinions. The fundamental doctrine in the realistic position, as I understand it, is the doctrine that relations are external. This doctrine is not correctly expressed by saying that two terms which have a certain relation might have not had that relation. Such a statement introduces the notion of possibility and thus raises irrelevant difficulties. The doctrine may be expressed by saying that 1. Relatedness does not imply any corresponding complexity in the relata. 2. Any given entity is a constituent of many different complexes. Each of these propositions requires some expansion. 1. The view which is intended to be denied by this proposition is the view that, whenever a term A has a certain relation R to a certain other term B, that implies some element in A in virtue of which it has the relation R to B. It is usual in this connection to speak rather of the nature of A than of A, and it is not clear whether the nature of A is or is not identical with A. But in any case, this nature, according to the view we are denying, is complex, and contains a constituent which expresses or accounts for A's relation to B. Writers who advocate the view in question do not state what they mean by the nature of A. 3 views may be suggested. Alpha, we may suppose that the nature of A is identical with A. In this case, we affirm, on the basis of a reductio ad absurdum, that the contention that A's nature must contain a constituent which expresses or accounts for A's relation to B is demonstrably false. Beta. We may suppose that A's nature is all the propositions that are true of A, or all the complexes of which A is a constituent. In this case, the view in question becomes a truism, but fails to yield any of the consequences commonly deduced from it. Gamma. We may define the nature of A as its predicates or attributes, as opposed to its relations. This view requires a word of explanation. We are accustomed to dyadic, triadic, tetradic, and so on relations. A dyadic relation may be defined as one which can occur in propositions containing only 2 other terms, that is, as one such that the simplest propositions in which it occurs contain only 2 other terms. Similar definitions apply to triadic, tetradic, and so on relations. Now there may also be, I do not say there are, what we may call monadic concepts, that is, concepts which can occur in propositions having only one other term. Such concepts may be called predicates or attributes. It is of course the case that whenever a subject has a predicate, there is a dyadic relation of subject and predicate, but it does not follow that there is not also a proposition in which the predicate is merely predicated. The analogy of dyadic relations will make this clearer. Whenever A has the relation R to B, there is a triadic relation of A and R and B. But in this relation, R occurs as a term of the relation, not as the relating relation of the proposition. Similarly, if there are monadic concepts, the propositions in which they are said to have the relation of predication to their subjects will not be identical with the propositions in which they are actually predicated. Assuming, then, that there are monadic concepts, the nature of A may consist of all those monadic concepts which are predicable of A. Then the view that A's nature contains a constituent which expresses or accounts for A's relation to B will be the view that there is a monadic concept predicable of whatever has the said relation to B and of nothing else. More generally, the view in question may be stated as follows. Every propositional function of one variable is formally equivalent to some monadic propositional function, where a monadic propositional function is one which attributes a monadic concept to a variable subject. It is no concern of the doctrine of external relations either to affirm or deny the above view, though we must contend that there is no reason to suppose the above view to be true. We must, however, deny that a term is composed of all the monadic concepts which are predicable of it, that is, that a particular subject is identical with the sum of its predicates. I do not for a moment wish to suggest that any one of the above three views, alpha, beta, gamma, is held by any of the opponents of external relations. They, I believe, hold a confused mixture of all three, and would not continue their opposition if the confusion were removed. My purpose in setting forth the above three views was to make it clear what it is that I affirm and what it is that I deny. The view I advocate is that a term A may have a relation to a term B without there being any constituent of A corresponding to this relation. If this were false, simple terms could have no relations, and therefore could not enter into complexes. Hence every term would have to be strictly infinitely complex. 2. Authors who deny external relations hold, in addition to the doctrine discussed above, that it is impossible for precisely the same term to be a constituent of two different complexes, or to occur in two different propositions. They say that if A is the father of B and the son of C, it is not strictly the same entity which is father and son, but that it is A qua father of B, who is the father of B, and A qua son of C, who is the son of C. This doctrine also is denied by those who advocate external relations. They would argue that A qua father of B is a complex containing the constituent A, and A qua son of B is also a complex containing the constituent A. Thus, the attempt to avoid an identical constituent in two complexes breaks down. The two parts of the doctrine of external relations together constitute the justification of analysis, and the denial of the view that analysis is falsification. The importance of the question as to the value of relations lies in the fact that current arguments against realism and pluralism almost all depend upon the doctrine of internal relations. When this doctrine is rejected, the question as to the number of things that exist becomes purely empirical, but no empirical fact is more certain, if a priori refutations fail, than that many things exist. I should therefore prefer to call the philosophy which I advocate pluralism rather than realism, because realism, in most of its accepted uses, involves long and difficult arguments which might be rejected without contravening anything that was said above as to the nature of relations. Nevertheless, if any case is to be made out against this or that form of realism on the basis of external relations, it will have to be a new case, based upon quite different arguments from those hitherto employed by idealists. I do not myself believe that any such case can be made out. At the same time, all the questions involved seem to me to demand fresh discussion, and what seems to me so far firmly established is a logic and a method, rather than any positive metaphysical results. What is plain is that all arguments based on the contention that knowing makes a difference to what is known, or implies a community or interaction between knower and known, rests upon the internal view of relations, and therefore fail when this view is rejected. It is true that there is another argument for idealism, namely the argument which Professor Perry calls the egocentric predicament. This argument is, in brief, that everything must be known, because we cannot know of anything else. This is a foolish fallacy, which would equally prove that I must be acquainted with everybody whose name is Smith. Sometimes, more plausibly, it is urged merely that we cannot know that there are things we do not know. But this view rests upon a wrong analysis of general propositions, in fact upon the same wrong analysis which led Mill to regard Barbara as a petitio principii. When we know a general proposition, that does not require that we should know all or any of the instances of it. All the multiplication sums that never have been and never will be thought of by any human being deal with numbers over 1,000 is obviously a true proposition, although no instance of such a sum can ever be given. It is therefore perfectly possible to know that there are propositions we do not know, in spite of the fact that we can give no instance of such a proposition. Thus it is fallacious not merely to argue that everything must be known, but even to argue that we cannot know that there are things which we do not know. This instance, like many others, illustrates the elementary blunders which philosophers have made owing to their neglect of logic. To sum up, the primary philosophic effect of the logical doctrines which I share with the "6 realists" seems to me mainly negative. It shows that most current philosophical argument is fallacious, and that many questions which have been supposed amenable to a priori treatment must be dealt with empirically, since logic leaves the alternatives undecided. At the same time, in all those matters in which philosophy has been led to contravene science and common sense, there is a presumption, if the arguments of philosophers have been unsound, that their conclusions have been false. Hence the logic in question naturally associates itself with pluralism and realism rather than with monism and idealism. Moreover, by the rejection of a priori constructions, the way is open for philosophy to become inductive, and to begin the patient, cooperative accumulation of results by which the triumphs of science have been achieved. B. Russell, Cambridge, England. End of The Basis of Realism by Bertrand Russell.
Children in Prison and Other Cruelties of Prison Life by Oscar Wilde. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Reading by Rob Board. Some Cruelties of Prison Life. The Editor of the Daily Chronicle. Sir, I learn with great regret, through an extract from the columns of your paper, that the warder Martin of Reading Prison has been dismissed by the prison commissioners for having given some sweet biscuits to a little hungry child. I saw the 3 children myself on the Monday preceding my release. They had just been convicted, and were standing in a row in the central hall in their prison dress, carrying their sheets under their arms, previous to their being sent to the cells allotted to them. I happened to be passing along one of the galleries on my way to the reception room, where I was to have an interview with a friend. They were quite small children, the youngest, the one to whom the warder gave the biscuits, being a tiny little chap, for whom they had evidently been unable to find clothes small enough to fit. I had, of course, seen many children in prison during the 2 years during which I was myself confined. Wandsworth Prison, especially, contained always a large number of children. But the little child I saw on the afternoon of Monday, the 17th, at Reading, was tinier than any one of them. I need not say how utterly distressed I was to see these children at Reading, for I knew the treatment in store for them. The cruelty that is practised by day and night on children in English prisons is incredible, except to those who have witnessed it and are aware of the brutality of the system. People nowadays do not understand what cruelty is. They regard it as a sort of terrible medieval passion, and connect it with the race of men like Eccelin de Romano and others, to whom the deliberate infliction of pain gave a real madness of pleasure. But men of the stamp of Eccelin are merely abnormal types of perverted individualism. Ordinary cruelty is simply stupidity. It comes from the entire want of imagination. It is the result in our days of stereotyped systems of hard and fast rules, of centralization, of officialism, and of irresponsible authority. Wherever there is centralization, there is stupidity. What is inhuman in modern life is officialism. Authority is as destructive to those who exercise it as it is to those on whom it is exercised. It is the prison board, with the system that it carries out, that is the primary source of the cruelty that is exercised on a child in prison. The people who uphold the system have excellent intentions. Those who carry it out are humane in intention also. Responsibility is shifted onto the disciplinary regulations. It is supposed that because a thing is the rule, it is right. The present treatment of children is terrible, primarily from people not understanding the peculiar psychology of a child's nature. A child can understand a punishment inflicted by an individual, such as a parent or guardian, and bear it with a certain amount of acquiescence. What it cannot understand is a punishment inflicted by society. It cannot realize what society is. With grown people it is, of course, the reverse. Those of us who are either in prison or have been sent there can understand, and do understand, what that collective force called society means, and whatever we may think of its methods or claims, we can force ourselves to accept it. Punishment inflicted on us by an individual, on the other hand, is a thing that no grown person endures, or is expected to endure. The child, consequently, being taken away from its parents by people whom it has never seen, and of whom it knows nothing, and finding itself in a lonely and unfamiliar cell, waited on by strange faces, and ordered about and punished by the representatives of a system that it cannot understand, becomes an immediate prey to the first and most prominent emotion produced by modern prison life, the emotion of terror. The terror of a child in prison is quite limitless. I remember once at Reading, as I was going out to exercise, seeing in the dimly lit cell right opposite my own a small boy. Two warders, not unkindly men, were talking to him with some sternness apparently, or perhaps giving him some useful advice about his conduct. One was in the cell with him, the other was standing outside. The child's face was like a white wedge of sheer terror. There was in his eyes the mute appeal of a hunted animal. The next morning I heard him at breakfast time crying and calling to be let out. His cry was for his parents. From time to time I could hear the deep voice of the warder on duty warning him to keep quiet. Yet he was not even convicted of whatever little offence he had been charged with. He was simply on remand. That I knew by his wearing his own clothes, which seemed neat enough. He was, however, wearing prison socks and shoes. This showed that he was a very poor boy, whose own shoes, if he had any, were in a bad state. Justices and magistrates, an entirely ignorant class as a rule, often remand children for a week, and then perhaps remit whatever sentence they are entitled to pass. They call this not sending a child to prison. It is, of course, a stupid view on their part. To a little child, whether he is in prison on remand or after conviction, is a subtlety of social position he cannot comprehend. To him the horrible thing is to be there at all. In the eyes of humanity, it should be a horrible thing for him to be there at all. This terror that seizes and dominates the child, as it seizes the grown man also, is of course intensified beyond power of expression by the solitary cellular system of our prisons. Every child is confined to its cell for 23 hours out of the 24. This is the appalling thing. To shut up a child in a dimly lit cell for 23 hours out of the 24 is an example of the cruelty of stupidity. If an individual, parent or guardian, did this to a child, he would be severely punished. The Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Children would take the matter up at once. There would be on all hands the utmost detestation of whomsoever had been guilty of such cruelty. A heavy sentence would undoubtedly follow conviction, but our own actual society does worse itself, and to the child to be so treated by a strange abstract force, of whose claims it has no cognizance, is much worse than it would be to receive the same treatment from its father or mother or someone it knew. The inhuman treatment of a child is always inhuman by whomsoever it is inflicted. But inhuman treatment by society is to the child the more terrible because there is no appeal. A parent or guardian can be moved, and let out the child from the dark, lonely room in which it is confined, but a warder cannot. Most warders are very fond of children, but the system prohibits them from rendering the child any assistance. Should they do so, as Warder Martin did, they are dismissed. The second thing from which a child suffers in prison is hunger. The food that is given to it consists of a piece of usually badly baked prison bread and a tin of water for breakfast at 7:30. At 12 o'clock it gets dinner, composed of a tin of coarse Indian meal stirred about, and at 5:30 it gets a piece of dry bread and a tin of water for its supper. This diet, in the case of a strong grown man, is always productive of illness of some kind, chiefly, of course, diarrhea, with its attendant weakness. In fact, in a big prison, astringent medicines are served out regularly by the warders as a matter of course. In the case of a child, the child is, as a rule, incapable of eating the food at all. Anyone who knows anything about children knows how easily a child's digestion is upset by a fit of crying, or trouble and mental distress of any kind. A child who has been crying all day long, and perhaps half the night, in a lonely, dimly lit cell, and is preyed upon by terror, simply cannot eat food of this coarse, horrible kind. In the case of the little child to whom Warder Martin gave the biscuits, the child was crying with hunger on Tuesday morning and utterly unable to eat the bread and water served to it for its breakfast. Martin went out after the breakfasts had been served and bought the few sweet biscuits for the child rather than see it starving. It was a beautiful action on his part, and was so recognized by the child, who, utterly unconscious of the regulation of the prison board, told one of the senior warders how kind this junior warder had been to him. The result was, of course, a report and a dismissal. I know Martin extremely well, and I was under his charge for the last 7 weeks of my imprisonment. On his appointment at Reading he had charge of Gallery C, in which I was confined, so I saw him constantly. I was struck by the singular kindness and humanity of the way in which he spoke to me, and to the other prisoners. Kind words are much in prison, and a pleasant good morning or good evening will make one as happy as one can be in solitary confinement. He was always gentle and considerate. I happen to know another case in which he showed great kindness to one of the prisoners, and I have no hesitation in mentioning it. One of the most horrible things in prison is the badness of the sanitary arrangements. No prisoner is allowed under any circumstances to leave his cell after 5:30 p.m. If, consequently, he is suffering from diarrhea, he has to use his cell as a latrine, and pass the night in a most fetid and unwholesome atmosphere. Some days before my release, Martin was going the rounds at 7:30 with one of the senior warders for the purpose of collecting the oakum and tools of the prisoners. A man just convicted, and suffering from violent diarrhea in consequence of the food, as is always the case, asked this senior warder to allow him to empty the slops in his cell on account of the horrible odour of the cell and the possibility of illness again in the night. The senior warder refused absolutely. It was against the rules. The man, as far as he was concerned, had to pass the night in this dreadful condition. Martin, however, rather than see this wretched man in such a loathsome predicament, said he would empty the man's slops himself, and did so. A warder emptying a prisoner's slops is, of course, against the rules, but Martin did this act of kindness to the man out of the simple humanity of his nature, and the man was naturally most grateful. As regards the children, a great deal has been talked and written lately about the contaminating influence of prison on young children. What is said is quite true. A child is utterly contaminated by prison life, but the contaminating influence is not that of the prisoners, it is that of the whole prison system, of the governor, the chaplain, the warders, the lonely cell, the isolation, the revolting food, the rules of the prison commissioners, the mode of discipline, as it is termed, of the life. Every care is taken to isolate a child from the sight even of all prisoners over 16 years of age. Children sit behind a curtain in chapel, and are sent to take exercise in small sunless yards, sometimes a stone yard, sometimes a yard at the back of the mills, rather than that they should see the elder prisoners at exercise. But the only really humanizing influence in prison is the influence of the prisoners. Their cheerfulness under terrible circumstances, their sympathy for each other, their humility, their gentleness, their pleasant smiles of greeting when they meet each other, their complete acquiescence in their punishments, are all quite wonderful, and I myself learned many sound lessons from them. I am not proposing that the children should not sit behind a curtain in chapel, or that they should take exercise in a corner of the common yard. I am merely pointing out that the bad influence on children is not, and could never be, that of the prisoners, but is, and will always remain, that of the prison system itself. There is not a single man in Reading Gaol that would not gladly have done the 3 children's punishment for them. When I saw them last, it was on the Tuesday following their conviction. As I was taking exercise at 11:30 with about 12 other men, as the 3 children passed near us, in charge of a warder, from the damp, dreary stone yard in which they had been at their exercise, I saw the greatest pity and sympathy in the eyes of my companions as they looked at them. Prisoners are, as a class, extremely kind and sympathetic to each other. Suffering and the community of suffering makes people kind, and day after day as I tramped the yard I used to feel with pleasure and comfort what Carlyle calls somewhere the silent rhythmic charm of human companionship. In this, as in all other things, philanthropists and people of that kind are astray. It is not the prisoners who need reformation. It is the prisons. Of course, no child under 14 years of age should be sent to prison at all. It is an absurdity, and, like many absurdities, of absolutely tragic results. If, however, they are to be sent to prison, during the daytime they should be in a workshop or schoolroom with a warder. At night they should sleep in a dormitory with a night warder to look after them. they should be allowed exercise for at least 3 hours a day. The dark, badly ventilated, ill-smelling prison cells are dreadful for a child, dreadful indeed for anyone. One is always breathing bad air in prison. The food given to children should consist of tea and bread and butter and soup. Prison soup is very good and wholesome. A resolution of the House of Commons could settle the treatment of children in half an hour. I hope you will use your influence to have this done. The way that children are treated at present is really an outrage on humanity and common sense. It comes from stupidity. Let me draw attention now to another terrible thing that goes on in English prisons. Indeed, in prisons all over the world where the system of silence and cellular confinement is practised. I refer to the large number of men who become insane or weak-minded in prison. In convict prisons this is, of course, quite common, but in ordinary jails also, such as that in which I was confined in, it is to be found. About 3 months ago I noticed amongst the prisoners who took exercise with me a young man who seemed to be silly or half-witted. Every prison, of course, has its half-witted clients who return again and again, and may be said to live in the prison. But this young man struck me as being more than usually half-witted on account of his silly grin and idiotic laughter to himself, and the peculiar restlessness of his eternally twitching hands. He was noticed by all the other prisoners on account of the strangeness of his conduct. From time to time he did not appear at exercise, which showed me that he was being punished by confinement in his cell. Finally I discovered that he was under observation and being watched night and day by warders. When he did appear at exercise he always seemed hysterical, and used to walk round crying or laughing. At chapel he had to sit right under the observation of 2 warders, who carefully watched him all the time. Sometimes he would bury his head in his hands, an offence against the chapel regulations, and his head would be immediately struck up by a warder, so that he should keep his eyes fixed permanently in the direction of the communion table. Sometimes he would cry, not making any disturbance, but with tears streaming down his face and a hysterical throbbing in the throat. Sometimes he would grin idiot-like to himself and make faces. He was on more than one occasion sent out of chapel to his cell, and of course he was continually punished. As the bench on which I used to sit in chapel was directly behind the bench at the end of which this unfortunate man was placed, I had full opportunity of observing him. I also saw him, of course, at exercise continually, and I saw that he was becoming insane, and was being treated as if he was shamming. On Saturday week last I was in my cell at about 1 o'clock, occupied in cleaning and polishing the tins I had been using for dinner. Suddenly I was startled by the prison silence being broken by the most horrible and revolting shrieks, or rather howls, for at first I thought some animal like a bull or a cow was being unskilfully slaughtered outside the prison walls. I soon realized, however, that the howls proceeded from the basement of the prison, and I knew that some wretched man was being flogged. I need not say how hideous and terrible it was for me, and I began to wonder who it was who was being punished in this revolting manner. Suddenly it dawned upon me that they might be flogging this unfortunate lunatic. My feelings on the subject need not be chronicled. They have nothing to do with the question. The next day, Sunday 16th, I saw the poor fellow at exercise, his weak, ugly, wretched face bloated by tears and hysteria almost beyond recognition. He walked in the centre ring along with the old men, the beggars and the lame people, so that I was able to observe him the whole time. It was my last Sunday in prison, a perfectly lovely day, the finest day we had had the whole year, and there, in the beautiful sunlight, walked this poor creature, made once in the image of God. grinning like an ape and making with his hands the most fantastic gestures, as though he was playing in the air on some invisible stringed instrument, or arranging and dealing counters in some curious game. All the while these hysterical tears, without which none of us ever saw him, were making soiled runnels on his white, swollen face. The hideous and deliberate grace of his gestures made him like an antic. He was a living grotesque. The other prisoners all watched him, and not one of them smiled. Everybody knew what had happened to him, and that he was being driven insane, was insane already. After half an hour he was ordered in by the warder, and, I suppose, punished. At least he was not at exercise on Monday, though I think I caught sight of him at the corner of the stone-yard, walking in charge of a warder. On the Tuesday, my last day in prison, I saw him at exercise. He was worse than before, and again was sent in. Since then I know nothing of him, but I found out from one of the prisoners who walked with me at exercise that he had 24 lashes in the cook-house on Saturday afternoon by order of the visiting justices on the report of the doctor. The howls that had horrified us all were his. This man is undoubtedly becoming insane. Prison doctors have no knowledge of mental disease of any kind. They are, as a class, ignorant men. The pathology of the mind is unknown to them. When a man grows insane, they treat him as shamming. They have him punished again and again. Naturally, the man becomes worse. When ordinary punishments are exhausted, the doctor reports the case to the justices. The result is flogging. Of course, the flogging is not done with a cat of nine tails. It is what is called birching. The instrument is a rod, but the result on the wretched half-witted man may be imagined. His number is, or was, A211. I also managed to find out his name. It is Prince. Something should be done at once for him. He is a soldier, and his sentence is one of court-martial. The term is 6 months. 3 have yet to run. May I ask you to use your influence to have this case examined into, and to see that the lunatic prisoner is properly treated? No report by the medical commissioners is of any avail. It is not to be trusted. The medical inspectors do not seem to understand the difference between the entire absence of a function or organ and the diseases of a function or organ. This man, A211, will, I have no doubt, be able to tell his name, the nature of his offence, the day of the month, the date of the beginning and expiration of his sentence, and answer any ordinary simple question. But that his mind is diseased admits of no doubt. At present it is a horrible duel between himself and the doctor. The doctor is fighting for a theory, the man is fighting for his life. I am anxious that the man should win. But let the whole case be examined into by experts who understand brain disease, and by people of humane feelings who have still some common sense and some pity. There is no reason that the sentimentalist should be asked to interfere. He always does harm. He culminates at his starting point. His end, as his origin, is an emotion. The case is a special instance of the cruelty inseparable from a stupid system. For the present governor of Reading is a man of gentle and humane character, greatly liked and respected by all the prisoners. He was appointed in July last, and though he cannot alter the rules of the prison system, he has altered the spirit in which they used to be carried out under his predecessor. He is very popular with the prisoners and with the warders. Indeed, he has quite elevated the whole tone of the prison life. Upon the other hand, the system is of course beyond his reach as far as altering its rules is concerned. I have no doubt that he sees daily much of what he knows to be unjust, stupid, and cruel, but his hands are tied. Of course I have no knowledge of his real views of the case of A211, nor indeed of any of his views on our present system. I merely judge him by the complete change he brought about in Reading Prison. Under his predecessor the system was carried out with the greatest harshness and stupidity. I remain, sir, your obedient servant, Oscar Wilde. France, May 27th, 1897. End of Children in Prison and Other Cruelties of Prison Life by Oscar Wilde.
T.F. Boyesen on Grundtvig and Kierkegaard, from the Intellectual Repository for the New Church, 1863. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Haugesund per Drammen, Norway, April 23, 1863. Dear Sir, regarding the affairs of the Church, we have this year suffered a disappointment. To this session of our House of Representatives the Government has sent a project of law, by which the Government officers, the theologians of course exempted, should have the right to belong to whatever Christian denomination they pleased. Among the advocates of the measure were almost all the members of the intelligent classes, and amongst the most earnest the representatives of the clergy, except one or two. Had the project required only a majority, it would have become law, but as the Constitution requires for such measures the votes of 2/3 of the members, it failed for want of a few votes, the peasantry being chiefly against it. But of its future success we have reason to entertain good hopes, for though life moves slowly with us, the attentive eye sees it progressing spiritually as well as naturally. One of the most remarkable appearances of our time is the change going on with the clergy of the Established Church. Their Protestantism consisted chiefly in opposing everything new, but this is much altered. Besides the part they took in the House of Representatives, they have come forward and warmly supported, through the press, the cause of religious liberty. 10 or 15 years ago we heard from the pulpit almost nothing but faith, and those who did not agree with them were made to feel their displeasure. Now many of them confess that the word is given as a means of acquiring goodness, or love to the Lord and the neighbor, to which faith is a means. That something in the doctrines of the Church is wrong is more and more felt amongst them. We are groping in a thick wood, but we dare hope that a Holy Spirit will lead us to the truth, said a clergyman to me. In a conversation with a theologian, I presented the views of the new Church concerning the sacraments. After quietly listening to me, he said, "Something of that kind has really been foreshadowed in my mind." And another clergyman admitted the correspondences between natural and spiritual things. May we not herein see the increased influence in the spiritual world as its numbers are increased for the Church? But it is also gratifying to perceive how even those who know not the genuine truth must work for the fulfillment of the Lord's merciful ends. As such, I think that two celebrated Danes, though in very different respects, have a prominent place. The one is a yet living, gifted clergyman and poet, Severin Grundtvig. As a man of strong intellect, he cannot be satisfied with anything in which he does not find some real spiritual life. And for want of a key given us by Swedenborg, he has fallen into the error of undervaluing the letter of the Old Testament, together with other essential parts of the Word. He has therefore vigorously assailed the literal thraldom of the Church. Admired as a great genius and an eloquent minister, and venerated as a pious Christian, it may not appear strange to us that he has gained a respectable party amongst the laity and clergy both in Denmark and here. among whom are many gifted men proclaiming with youthful enthusiasm the spirituality of the Bible, without, however, having the key to unlock its hidden treasures. Still, though on a wrong track, we cannot overlook the good to which the movement may lead, as it opens the eyes of the people to the necessity of a spiritual sense of the word, and another key to it than the vague notions of men. But more positively in the service of truth has Søren Kierkegaard worked. I feel my inability to give a correct idea of the rich authorship of this champion of Christianity, who has found a better conductor to the truth than the philosophers of our time. Having long lost sight of his writings, it is with distrust I attempt to give a sketch of them. The intelligent classes in Denmark and Norway have long and painfully felt the deficiency of the established religion to satisfy their spiritual wants. They were looking in vain for a word that would solve the problems of life. Then sounded a voice through Europe: "The spirit of the times rules the world," and "To think is to be." Yes, this must be the truth, was re-echoed from thousands of hearts. The great Hegel has said it. All rejoiced. Broken forever is the chain of the Church. The schools of science are the right churches. The thought is the true Messias. That man who dares contradict this has no right to be called a man, for he is only a brute. From even the pulpit these new dogmas were taught and explained, and the word interpreted according to them. But they were not long to remain in the uninterrupted enjoyment of this. While all appeared glad and happy, at once the flood of writings fell on the public. Either or, fear and tremor, the reiteration, the idea of dread, the proviso, philosophic crumbs, states of life, postscript to philosophic crumbs, and some others. With great erudition, psychological acuteness, remarkable dialectical and logical power, with almost unequalled command of language, together with a great amount of Christian experience, they uncover the dark recesses of the human heart, and throw light therein from the holy word. Following the philosophers of our time, step by step, they show the psychological consequences of the new doctrines, and after having in this way shown what Christianity is not, in his book entitled Works of Love, he explains what it really is. And the man who had the courage to step forward in this way was candidate in theology and magi philosophae, Søren Ebbe Kierkegaard. But at the same time that he directed a powerful blow against the philosophers, he did not forget the deficiencies of the Church, having in a multitude of sermons laid them open to view. On account of this, we thought to have found in him a new church brother, but a thorough perusal of his writings has altered our opinions. Being a light, he has, however, had, and still more will in future have, a beneficial influence upon his countrymen, having taught them what the essentials of Christianity are, and in this way prepared a new era for the Church, an opinion even entertained amongst the clergy themselves. Speaking once with a gifted clergyman about him, he remarked, "He has commenced a new epoch in the Church, but in what direction it tends we don't understand. The future can only solve this problem." This, from their point of view, is perfectly true. Having shown what Christianity is, without rectifying the wrong ideas concerning the Lord and his atonement, Kierkegaard necessarily comes in contradiction with himself, and this weak side his opponents have not overlooked. Thus, notwithstanding there is too much of real life in his works to be wholly overlooked, earnest Christians regard him as John the Baptist was looked upon, as a precursor of a greater light. In these facts I account for the tolerance prevalent among the clergy in these times. Doubts painful to the earnest have seized all classes of intelligent minds. For years we have been accustomed to devour all kinds of German theology having the stamp of orthodox Lutheranism, and now they stand almost unsold on the shelves of the booksellers, the people having become disgusted with them. And in their place we now find, in increasing numbers, translations of English sermons, for instance, of the Baptist Prescott. The first time my eye fell upon that name, my heart beat for joy, thinking the work to be from the pen of a new church minister that had found its way here. But I was soon convinced of my mistake. In hopes of better times, my brother, Captain C. Boyesen, has translated a good many sermons of Prescott Hiller's, and I some of Noble's and Dr. Bailey's. But we have not been able to get them published for want of the necessary means. But for these sermons to do much good, we need first of all the writings of Swedenborg translated in our language, and if possible in our country. We trust in the Lord that this may be granted us. For many years we have been longing for a man who with the necessary qualifications would sacrifice himself for the truth's sake. This hope now appears to be gratified. Our brother, H. Boyesen, having for more than 10 years diligently studied the writings of the Church, is now expected home after a stay of 4 years in America, England, and France, in order to profit by intercourse with prominent men of the Church. May his future use be in proportion to his personal sacrifices and devotedness to our cause. With my kindest regards to all friends, I remain, dear sir, very truly yours, T.F. Boyesen. End of T.F. Boyesen on Grundtvig and Kierkegaard, from the Intellectual Repository for the New Church, 1863.
Chapter 6 of Flying Machine Construction and Operation by W. J. Jackman and Thomas H. Russell. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to learn how to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Chapter 6. Learning to Fly. Don't be too ambitious at the start. Go slow and avoid unnecessary risks. At its best, there is an element of danger in aviation which cannot be entirely eliminated, but it may be greatly reduced and minimized by the use of common sense. Theoretically, the proper way to begin a glide is from the top of an incline, facing against the wind, so that the machine will soar until the attraction of gravitation draws it gradually to the ground. This is the manner in which experienced aviators operate, but it must be kept in mind that these men are experts. They understand air currents, know how to control the action and direction of their machines by shifting the position of their bodies, and by so doing avoid accidents which would be unavoidable by a novice. Begin on level ground. Make your first flights on level ground, having a couple of men assist you in getting the apparatus under headway. Take your position in the center rectangle, back far enough to give the forward edges of the glider an inclination to tilt upward very slightly. Now, start and run forward at a moderately rapid gait, one man at each end of the glider assisting you. As the glider cuts into the air, the wind will catch under the uplifted edges of the curved planes and buoy it up so that it will rise in the air and take you with it. This rise will not be great, just enough to keep you well clear of the ground. Now, project your legs a little to the front, so as to shift the center of gravity a trifle and bring the edges of the glider on an exact level with the atmosphere. This, with the momentum acquired in the start, will keep the machine moving forward for some distance. Effect of body movements. When the weight of the body is slightly back of the center of gravity, the edges of the advancing planes are tilted slightly upward. The glider in this position acts as a scoop, taking in the air which, in turn, lifts it off the ground. When a certain altitude is reached, this varies with the force of the wind, the tendency to a forward movement is lost and the glider comes to the ground. It is to prolong the forward movement as much as possible that the operator shifts the center of gravity slightly, bringing the apparatus on an even keel, as it were, by lowering the advancing edges. This done, so long as there is momentum enough to keep the glider moving, it will remain afloat. If you shift your body well forward, it will bring the front edges of the glider down and elevate the rear ones. In this way, the air will be spilled out at the rear, and having lost the air support or buoyancy, the glider comes down to the ground. A few flights will make any ordinary man proficient in the control of his apparatus by his body movements, not only as concerns the elevating and depressing of the advancing edges, but also actual steering. You will quickly learn, for instance, that as the shifting of the body weight backwards and forwards affects the upward and downward trend of the planes, so a movement sideways, to the left or the right, affects the direction in which the glider travels. Ascends at an angle. In ascending, the glider and flying machine, like the bird, makes an angular, not a vertical flight. Just what this angle of ascension may be is difficult to determine. It is probable, and in fact altogether likely, that it varies with the force of the wind, weight of the rising body, power of propulsion, etc. This, in the language of physicists, is the angle of inclination, and, as a general thing, under normal conditions, still air, should be put down as about 1 in 10, or 5 3/4 degrees. This would be an ideal condition, but it has not, as yet, been reached. The force of the wind affects the angle considerably, as does also the weight and velocity of the apparatus. In general practice, the angle varies from 23 to 45 degrees. At more than 45 degrees, the supporting effort is overcome by the resistance to forward motion. Increasing the speed or propulsive force tends to lessen the angle at which the machine may be successfully operated because it reduces the wind pressure. Most of the modern flying machines are operated at an angle of 23 degrees or less. Maintaining an equilibrium. Stable equilibrium is one of the main essentials to successful flight, and this cannot be preserved in an uncertain gusty wind, especially by an amateur. The novice should not attempt a glide unless the conditions are just right. These conditions are a clear, level space, without obstructions such as trees, etc., and a steady wind of not exceeding 12 miles an hour. Always fly against the wind. When a reasonable amount of proficiency in the handling of the machine on level ground has been acquired, the field of practice may be changed to some gentle slope. In starting from a slope, it will be found easier to keep the machine afloat. But the experience at first is likely to be very disconcerting to a man of less than iron nerve. As the glider sails away from the top of the slope, the distance between him and the ground increases rapidly until the aviator thinks he is up 100 miles in the air. If he will keep cool, manipulate his apparatus so as to preserve its equilibrium, and let nature take its course, he will come down gradually and safely to the ground at a considerable distance from the starting place. This one advantage of starting from an elevation: your machine will go further. But if the aviator becomes rattled, if he loses control of his machine, serious results, including a bad fall with risk of death, are almost certain. And yet this practice is just as necessary as the initial lessons on level ground. When judgment is used, and haste made slowly, there is very little real danger. While experimenting with gliders, the Wrights made flights innumerable under all sorts of conditions, and never had an accident of any kind. Effects of wind currents. The larger the machine, the more difficult it will be to control its movements in the air, and yet enlargement is absolutely necessary as weight, in the form of motor, rudder, etc., is added. Air currents near the surface of the ground are diverted by every obstruction unless the wind is blowing hard enough to remove the obstruction entirely. Take, for instance, the case of a tree or shrub in a moderate wind from 10 to 12 miles an hour. As the wind strikes the tree, it divides, part going to one side and part going to the other, while still another part is directed upward and goes over the top of the obstruction. This makes the handling of a glider on an obstructed field difficult and uncertain. To handle a glider successfully, the place of operation should be clear and the wind moderate and steady. If it is gusty, postpone your flight. In this connection, it will be well to understand the velocity of the wind and what it means, as shown in the following table.
10 miles per hour equals 14.7 feet per second, with a pressure of 0.492 per square foot. 25 miles per hour equals 36.7 feet per second, with a pressure of 3.075 per square foot. 50 miles an hour equals 73.3 feet per second, with a pressure of 12.300 per square foot. 100 miles per hour equals 146.6 feet per second, with a pressure of 49.200 per square foot.
Pressure of wind increases in proportion to the square of the velocity. Thus, wind at 10 miles an hour has 4 times the pressure of wind at 5 miles an hour. The greater this pressure, the larger and heavier the object which can be raised. Any boy who has had experience in flying kites can testify to this. High winds, however, are almost invariably gusty and uncertain as to direction, and this makes them dangerous for aviators. It is also a self-evident fact that, beyond a certain stage, the harder the wind blows, the more difficult it is to make headway against it. Launching device for gliders. On page 195 will be found a diagram of the various parts of a launcher for gliders, designed and patented by Mr. Octave Chanute. In describing this invention in aeronautics, Mr. Chanute says: "In practicing, the track, preferably portable, is generally laid in the direction of the existing wind, and the car, preferably a light platform car, is placed on the track. The truck, carrying the winding drum and its motor, is placed to windward a suitable distance, say from 200 to 1,000 feet, and is firmly blocked or anchored in line with the portable track, which is preferably 80 or 100 feet in length. The flying or gliding machine to be launched with its operator is placed on the platform car at the leeward end of the portable track. The line, which is preferably a flexible combination of wire and cord cable, is stretched between the winding drum on the track and detachably secured to the flying or gliding machine, preferably by means of a trip hoop or else held in the hand of the operator, so that the operator may readily detach the same from the flying machine when the desired height is attained. How the glider is started. Then, upon a signal given by the operator, the engineer at the motor puts it into operation, gradually increasing the speed until the line is wound upon the drum at a maximum speed of, say, 30 miles an hour. The operator of the flying machine, whether he stands upright and carries it on his shoulders, or whether he sits or lies down prone upon it, adjusts the aeroplane or carrying surfaces so that the wind shall strike them on the top and press downward instead of upward until the platform car, under action of the winding drum and line, attains the required speed. When the operator judges that his speed is sufficient, and this depends upon the velocity of the wind as well as that of the car moving against the wind, he quickly causes the front of the flying machine to tip upward, so that the relative wind striking on the underside of the planes or carrying surfaces shall lift the flying machine into the air. It then ascends like a kite to such height as may be desired by the operator, who then trips the hook and releases the line from the machine. What the operator does. The operator, now being free in the air, has a certain initial velocity imparted by the winding drum and line, and also a potential energy corresponding to his height above the ground. If the flying or gliding machine is provided with a motor, he can utilize that in his further flight, and if it is a simple gliding machine without motor, he can make a descending flight through the air to such distance as corresponds to the velocity acquired and the height gained, steering meanwhile by the devices provided for that purpose. The simplest operation or maneuver is to continue the flight straight ahead against the wind. But it is possible to vary this course to the right or left, or even to return in downward flight with the wind to the vicinity of the starting point. Upon nearing the ground, the operator tips upward his carrying surfaces and stops his headway upon the cushion of increased air resistance so caused. The operator is in no way permanently fastened to his machine, and the machine and the operator simply rest upon the light platform car, so that the operator is free to rise with the machine from the car whenever the required initial velocity is attained. Motor for the launcher. The motor may be of any suitable kind or construction, but is preferably an electric or gasoline motor. The winding drum is furnished with any suitable or customary reversing guide to cause the line to wind smoothly and evenly upon the drum. The line is preferably a cable composed of flexible wire and having a cotton or other cord core to increase its flexibility. the line extends from the drum to the flying or gliding machine. Its free end may, if desired, be grasped and held by the operator until the flying machine ascends to the desired height, when, by simply letting go of the line, the operator may continue his flight free. The line, however, is preferably connected to the flying or gliding machine directly by a trip hook, having a handle or trip lever within reach of the operator, so that when he ascends to the required height, he may readily detach the line from the flying or gliding machine. End of Learning to Fly by W.J. Jackman and Thomas H. Russell. Read by Scott Danaker, Elizabeth City, North Carolina. www.zeppelfart.com.
Letter from Bertrand Russell by Bertrand Russell. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Landon D.C. Elkind at the University of Iowa in Iowa City, Iowa. Letter from Bertrand Russell. To the editors of the Journal of Philosophy, Psychology, and Scientific Methods. In a quotation from the Athenaeum printed in this journal, footnote 1, volume 12, page 308, end of footnote 1, I am represented as having said, quote, "There may be perspectives where there are no minds, but we cannot know anything of what sort of perspectives they may be, for the sense datum is mental." End of quote. I did not see the Athenaeum, and do not remember what I said, but it cannot have been what I am reported as having said, for I hold strongly that the sense datum is not mental. Indeed, my whole philosophy of physics rests upon the view that the sense datum is purely physical. The fact of being a datum is mental, but a particular which is a datum is not logically dependent upon being a datum. A particular which is a datum does, however, appear to be causally dependent upon sense organs and nerves and brain. Since we carry those about with us, we cannot discover what sensibilia, if any, belong to perspectives from places where there is no brain. And since a particular of which we are aware is a sense datum, we cannot be aware of particulars which are not sense data, and can, therefore, have no empirical evidence as to their nature. This is merely the egocentric predicament. It is a tautology, not a great truth. It is for this reason, and not because sense data are mental, that we cannot know the nature of those perspectives, if any, which belong to places where there are no minds. I do not know what is the definition of mental. In order to obtain a definition, I should first inquire what would necessarily be removed from the world if it were what one would naturally call a world without mind. I see no reason why colours or noises should be removed, but facts which involve such relations as perceiving, remembering, desiring, enjoying, believing, would necessarily be removed. This suggests that no particulars of which we have experience are to be called mental, but that certain facts, involving certain relations, constitute what is essentially mental in the world of our experience. I use the word fact to designate that which makes a proposition true or false. It includes, I think, everything in the world except what is simple. The term mental, therefore, will be applicable to all facts involving such relations as those enumerated above. This is not yet a definition, since obviously these relations all have some common characteristic, and it must be this characteristic which will yield the proper definition of the term mental. But I do not know what this characteristic is. Very truly yours, B. Russell. Trinity College, Cambridge, June 7, 1915. End of letter from Bertrand Russell. By Bertrand Russell.
Linen rag paper from Typographia and Historical Sketch of the Origin and Progress of the Art of Printing, 1825, by Thomas Curson Hansard. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The inventor of linen rag paper, whoever he was, is entitled to the gratitude of posterity, who are enjoying the advantages of the discovery. The art of printing would have been comparatively of little importance without having the means of procuring a proper material to receive the impressions. While the papyrus was the only kind of paper, it was impossible to have procured it in sufficient quantities to have made large editions of books, without which the great bulk of mankind would have forever retained the ignorant barbarity of the Dark Ages. The cotton paper, though an improvement, was but a rude and coarse article, unfit for any of the nice purposes to which paper is now applied. The perfection of the art of paper making consisted in finding a material which could be procured in sufficient quantities and would be easy of preparation. Of such is made the better kind of paper now in use, as, for instance, that upon which this work is printed, the manufacture of which we shall endeavour to describe. A more common or economical substance could not be conceived than the tattered remnants of our clothes, linen worn out and otherwise incapable of being applied to the least use, and of which the quantity every day increases. Nor could a more simple labour be imagined than a few hours' trituration by mills. The dispatch is so great that it has been observed by a French writer that 5 workmen in a mill may furnish sufficient paper for the continued labour of 3,000 transcribers. This was on the supposition of the process being conducted upon the old system of hand labour. But by the improved system of our modern mills, where the paper is produced in a constant and regular sheet by a curious machine, instead of the workmen making sheet by sheet separately, the quantity produced is infinitely greater. The operations of paper making, as they succeed each other, are as follows. First, the rags are washed, if requisite, and then sorted. 2. They are bleached to render them white, but this is sometimes deferred to another stage of the process. 3. They are ground with water in the washing engine till they are reduced to a coarse or imperfect pulp, called half stuff, in which state the bleaching is sometimes performed, at other times it is bleached in the engine. 4. The half stuff is ground in the beating engine, and water added in sufficient quantity to make a fine pulp, which being conveyed to 5. the vat, the sheets of paper are made by taking up a quantity of the pulp upon a mould of fine wire cloth, through which the water drains away, and the pulp coagulates into a sheet of paper. To take this off the wire is called couching. 6th. The sheet is put in a pile with many others, with a felt between each, and the whole is subjected to a strong pressure to press out the superfluous water. 7. The sheets are taken out, the felts removed, and the sheets of paper pressed again by themselves for a certain time. 8. The sheets are taken from the press and hung up, 5 or 6 together, to dry in the drying loft. 9. The paper is dipped into a tub of fine size and pressed to force out the superfluity, after which it is dried again, but in printing papers this process is rendered unnecessary by sizing the stuff whilst in the engine by adding certain ingredients. 10. The paper now undergoes an examination of each individual sheet, and all knots and burrs are removed and bad sheets taken out, forming the cachie and retree. 11. The dry sheets are packed in a very large pile and pressed with a most immense force to render the sheets flat and smooth. 12. The paper is taken out, parted and pressed again. Parting means to take down the pile sheet by sheet and make another without turning the sheets over. By this means new surfaces are brought in contact with each other and the surface of the paper improved. 13. The paper is now finished and is counted into quires, folded and packed up in reams for market. The linen rags used for making paper, being collected by itinerant merchants, are purchased by wholesale dealers or rag merchants, who for the London trade separate them into 5 sorts of white rags, which they sell to the mills. They are denominated numbers 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, according to their respective qualities. Number 1, called London Superfine, being all linen, the remains of fine cloth, which, not being so much worn as the coarser sort, is used for making the finest paper. Number 5 is coarse canvas, which by bleaching may be brought to a good color, but will not make paper of the strength and fineness of the finer sorts. The next sort is rag bagging, a worse canvas, of which the bags are made for packing the rags. Colored rags are generally cotton of all colors except blue, which is selected for making blue paper only. Superfine paper for writing or fine printing can only be made from numbers 1, 2, and 3. Numbers 4 and 5 are appropriated for making an inferior paper called news, because used for newspapers. The colored rags are only used for the inferior papers. Woolen and silk rags are used for brown paper, but even for this purpose they should be mixed up with a large portion of coarse linen. Old paper may also serve for the same use, but the waste would be too considerable, whence it is rather reserved for pasteboard, in the manufacture of which the material is worked in less time, with less force, and with the same water. It will also lose much less. Besides, paper that has been once sized, though passed through boiling water, still gives the pulp a viscidity which ought to be guarded against. The rags, when first brought to the mill, if they are very dirty, as the coarse sorts generally are washed in hot water by a fulling mill, such as is used by dyers for washing cloth. The rags, being well dried, are, if they have not been previously sorted by the rag merchant, delivered to women to sort and scrape them. These women are disposed of in a large room full of old linen, seated 2 by 2 on benches with a large chest or box divided into 5 cases before them, for containing the 5 different sorts of rags as before mentioned. Each has a piece of pasteboard hung from her girdle and extended on her knees, upon which with a long sharp knife she unrips seams and stitches, and scrapes off all filth. Whatever can be used after being well shaken is distributed into the 3 cases according to the degree of fineness, and the women throw the rest at their feet. Those manufacturers who choose to be more exact in their sorting have 6 cases for 6 different sorts of rags: the superfine, the fine, the seams and stitches of the fine, the middling, the seams and stitches of the middling, and the coarse, without including the very coarse parts, which are reserved for making brown paper. Some manufacturers are persuaded that the labour of the sorters is never sufficiently exact, and think that the hems and seams should be kept apart, that the coarseness of the cloth should be considered, and that the cloth made of tow should be separated from that made of the longer slips, cloth of hemp from cloth of flax, and lastly that the degree of wearing in the cloth should be attended to. For if rags which are almost new should be mixed with those that are much worn, the one will not be reduced to a pulp in the mill, whilst the other will be so attenuated as to be carried away by the water and pass through the hair strainer, and hence there must be a considerable waste in the work, a real loss to the manufacturer, and even